Good morning, Admiral Madison, distinguished guests, and good morning all. Thanks, Lewis, for welcoming me here, and it's a great pleasure to be back here at the Australian Defence Force Academy. What I wanted to talk about today were some of the findings, as Lewis alluded to, from my PhD research, which I've just completed, which was a labour of love, but also quite a lengthy experience that has just been completed. The title of my PhD thesis is as you see it up on the board, but it's also subtitled The Dawn Horizon, which is a bit of a nod to New Horizon, which, as we all know, is the Air Force's approach to implementing the ADF's Pathways to Change agenda, which sought to achieve the aims that you see on the board. Now, in my observation of the implementation of New Horizon and Pathways to Change, I developed a bit of a hunch that the work that was being done was, and I hope I don't steal your thunder here, Sam, was being done downstream. And by that I mean in the operational areas of the Air Force, where I think that are important areas to look at in terms of cultural change. But to my mind, there was some work that could be done at the very start of our military careers, and by that I mean initial training. It also seemed to me that the way that these types of initiatives were being implemented was in a traditional military way, and by that I mean that we tend to prioritise the structural when we want to change things over and above other inputs to social behaviours and behavioural norms. And I'll have more to talk about in that area in a moment. However, for now, I guess it will suffice to say that these two hunches directed my the way that I wanted to do my PhD research in order to find out whether my hypothesis was correct. And my hypothesis was that induction training, as I talked about before, is a really, really critical point at which we as military members learn what it means to be part of an organisation. So all of this drew my attention to ADFA as a particularly unique environment where I could pull at the threads of some of my hypotheses. In particular, I wanted to give voice to a group that I think is often silent and overlooked to some extent in developing strategic cultural change initiatives, and that's people who are going through these early parts of training. And so that made me want to design a methodology that drew on the narratives and thoughts of people that were undergoing initial training, and it really made me focus in on officer initial training. As my PhD supervisor said, I had to narrow it down so that I would eventually finish it at some point. So I looked mainly at Air Force officer training, and I think, although my examiners may have something to say on that, it provided a data set that was really rich and quite unusual in addressing questions of cultural change. So it was a cross-country, cross-nation study. So I went to 3 different countries and 5 separate officer training institutions. All 3 countries are represented on the screen there. So I did some focus groups and interviews at the Royal Air Force College, Cranwell, so a direct entry officer institution. I went to the US Air Force Academy and also the US Air Force's Officer Training School. Did the same thing there. And also here in Australia, I came to ADFA and went down to Officer Training School in East Sale. So overall, my interest was in developing or trying to dig up any evidence that might support another hypothesis that the types of ideal identity characteristics that we learn during our basic training, so that are transmitted and received, as I said in that initial slide, I wanted to see whether they were congruent with the types of values that we expect of people in the Air Force. And more broadly, my PhD looks at whether the types of identity characteristics we teach in basic training are congruent with a Western liberal democracy. But what I'm going to present today, I think, are going to be some of the more peripheral bits of the data that came out that I found really, really fascinating, that speak to more specifically Air Force identity and how it is that we generate that at ADFA in particular. So I want to take a little quick dip first into some sociological theory, and I think that that'll be useful to help frame the discussion later on. So the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, in his work Distinction, expands on a concept of his called habitus, which he describes as systems of durable, transposable dispositions. So the easiest way for me to get my head around what he's talking about here is to describe habitus as like a toolbox that we all have, and within that toolbox we have various tools that allow us to interact within various social environments, which he calls a field. I'll talk about that in a moment. So he uses a sporting analogy to articulate this a bit more clearly, and he talks about how some sports people have a feel for the game, and I'm sure we've all seen sporting events where there is a particular player or players who just seem to know where the ball's going to go, or are clearly of a different standard to others just by fitting into that environment and the ease with which they perform. And I think this quote here from Don Bradman articulates what I'm talking about. That I think he went on to score 452 or something like that, but he was saying that sort of, you know, by the mid 400s he was starting to get a bit of a feel for what was going on out there. I talked about fields, so this is the environment within which we deploy our habitus. So Pierre Bourdieu here now talks about it as basically an area in which we all are in competition using relative power that we have at our disposal. And again, a sporting analogy I think is apt, where in sport there are generally a formalised set of rules or laws that govern what is and isn't outside the bounds of the technical and legal way of playing the game. But there are also informal rule structures that most of the players will adhere to, and it's quite obvious when one of them doesn't. So an example might be, I guess, in a soccer match where someone's injured and the opposition team will generally kick the ball out so that that person can get treatment and not, and so there isn't any advantage being taken by someone who is hurt. Right, and the third element of capital is what we call, well, Bourdieu talks about a variety of aspects of capital, but what I want to talk about here, and I think is most apt to the military, is his conceptualisation of symbolic capital. And this is assets that bring social and cultural advantage and disadvantage. Military, I think, reflects a lot of an even more specific element he talks about, which is embodied symbolic capital. So this is the type of stuff that we either do with our bodies or put on our bodies that imparts to others a certain type of message that we want to get across. So, you know, our uniforms are a great example of this, in that you don't need to necessarily know or even have met someone to get an idea of where they've been, what they've done, whether they've had operational service, whether they've you know, been rewarded for some sort of notable act. It's all embodied on the individual. But there's also embodied capital, I guess, that you could describe in terms of the way that a bodybuilder you know, works on certain areas of their body in order to either achieve something or to impart a certain impression. So Bourdieu pulls this all together in this theory here, which is the closest I got to any type of formula within my PhD. But all I'm putting that up there, I guess, to show you is that there's, in the way that he encapsulates it, there is an interrelation between all of these elements. So when I talked at the start about what I think we do within the military in terms of addressing cultural change, I think we do a lot of work in the area of the field. And by field, I mean the structural, you know, the laws, the rules of the organisation. So standing instructions, oversight mechanisms, bodies that do certain things within the organisation. Those are the things that we, I think, within the military like to address because they show resolve. They are things that we can change quickly. But as Bourdieu would suggest, the way that we behave is only, the field is only a portion of the inputs to that. So an example, I think, a really good example of this is the Broderick Review. So the Broderick Review, as you probably all know, made 21 recommendations, and I've done a little spreadsheet here that it articulates what I think they were trying to address in the context of Bourdieu's theory. So you can see there that of the 21, 19 of them, to my mind, only look at the field. So we're talking there about things like ensuring additional accountability, introducing new reporting mechanisms, setting up growth targets, SEMPRO as a new organisation to oversee complaints. And I think that there was really only two, which are those 5 and 6 there, that speak to any other element of Bourdieu's theory, which is capital there. So we're talking about in 4 and 5 about trying to change or reassess whether it is important that certain types of capital, i.e. being in the arms corps, are what are necessary to be in those top level leadership roles. So that all brings me to my fieldwork here at ADFA. So what I wanted to do, as I said earlier, was try to understand what were the main types of ideal characteristics that are being presented to cadets here, to try and understand what is in that toolbox, in the habitus. What are we trying to populate those toolboxes with for cadets to come out into the broader Air Force. But also, I wanted to understand what it is within ADFA's framework itself that are the types of capital that bring about the most useful social advantage and disadvantage. So I did, as I said before, focus groups, interviews, ended up with a massive amount of data. My supervisor kept telling me to stop, but I don't know, I got hooked on doing qualitative data gathering and ended up with way more data than I could analyse. But the analysis was done through content and discourse analysis. So content analysis, I looked at what people said, and discourse analysis, I looked at the way it was said and also the dynamic of the group when that was being said. And so I ended up with what I think was a really interesting sketch of the types of identity characteristics that are valued here at Air Force. So take these comments, for instance, all from ADFA cadets. So I think that each of the comments here speak to a gap in the understanding of what it means to be an Air Force officer for cadets here at ADFA. And I think that should be quite troubling for us, because I would imagine that what we want from the Air Force on graduation from Air Force cadets is for people who understand the organisation that they are going in to become junior leaders in. And I think that if you look at the last cadets' comments there, that in the absence of a coherent Air Force identity being presented here at ADFA, that toolbox is being populated with other inputs, which come from, I think, the influence of other services. So I drew on the work of a couple of other sociologists to try and cobble together a bit of a theory of what was going on here. So the words I used earlier on were sort of how I put this together. So basically, this theory sketches a sequential model which describes ideal characteristics being presented to cadets when they turn up here on their first day. And then that's from the work of Irving Goffman. He talks about presentation. And then there is a subsequent expectation that cadets then perform these types of ideal characteristics in order to navigate their way through the social environment that is ADFA. So presentation of ideal traits, I'll talk about first up. So here we've got some cadets that talk about, I think, how and what type of traits are presented to them when they're here at ADFA. So a common theme that was running through these comments was that some Air Force staff felt it necessary, and I think these two quotes articulate this quite well, they felt it necessary to modify the way that they would normally behave and act as an Air Force member when in the joint environment of ADFA. So as I said, in the sequential model, once you have been presented with a certain type of identity trait here at ADFA, there's an expectation that you perform it as a training institution. The theorist I used, Judith Butler, talks about it being the repetition of particular types of traits that generate the importance of them within a social environment. So again, some more comments from cadets here. This one in particular, I think, articulates the importance of particular types of capital over and above others. So he's talking here about his, I don't know, mid or end of year report with his DO, and the DO said, yeah, you know, it's good that you're passing or got a distinction or whatever, but you only did 10 heaves, and you need to do 20, and actually make it 30. So that and these types of comments as well, where you see that people are actually modifying what comes natural to them and what they think would be natural within an Air Force environment in order to fit through a particular stencil to get through this organisation. So if we go back to theory, to the theory again then, so I think this sequential model might be useful as a step toward modifying the way that we approach cultural change in order to make sure that we only aren't just looking at the structural elements of the inputs to social behaviour. So what I'm arguing basically here in my PhD is that what we teach people and what we show people here at ADFA as being important are critical, I guess, baselining activities that teach them what it means to be members of the Air Force. And at the moment, I think the data suggests that this is devoid of a strong Air Force influence. And I also think that the type of capital that we're expecting people to present is maybe not necessarily aligned with what we're doing. So, as this cadet here, I think hints at, I think what we need to do initially is try to articulate as an Air Force what it is that we want as the products of the training that occurs here at ADFA. If it is that we only want tertiary qualified people to then be enculturated into the Air Force, then there are clearly more cost-effective ways that we could do this. But if, as I suggest, or as I think should be the case, that we want people to come to this organisation and see ADFA as a really important joint institution in which we expect junior officers to graduate who feel like they're part of the fabric of the Air Force and have a deep understanding of its culture and values, then I think we can do better. So of fundamental importance, as I've argued today, is strengthening the way that we project an Air Force identity at the Academy. So what can we do? I've suggested three ways that we might be able to address some of the other areas within Bourdieu's framework here. One of them, I think, is looking at active management of staffing. In my experience of being a junior aircrew member, working up through the ranks, positions in training institutions are not always consistently valued, nor do we as an Air Force send, I think, a good representative sample of all of the specialisations that we have within the organisation to our training institutions. So that, I think, would address the capital part of it. We would, by sending pilots, ACOs, all across the spectrum of specialisations here, we would start to show that there are types of capital that are valued in the Air Force that aren't at the moment being shown here. A second point might be to look at the accurate presentation of an ideal Air Force identity, and this talks to, again, building this alternative capital. So if we see Air Force, or as cadets, if we see Air Force staff members presenting Air Force traits that are congruent with the ones that they go out and see on single service training, then I think that that is what we need to be doing. And then thirdly, speaking of single service training, I think that we need to do better to support, as an Air Force, the enculturation of Air Force cadets here. There was a theme that ran through the data of cadets going out to single service training. Well, even before they went to single service training, in many cases they would go on leave for some of the periods where Army and Navy cadets would go out to their parent services. And then when they did go out to single service training, it was a really inconsistent approach from the operational side of the Air Force to actually gainfully employing the cadets when they're out there. And I've seen this before at units that I've been at, where cadets coming are seen as a bit of a difficult proposition. They don't really know what to do with them because they're not trained. But there are certainly much better ways that we can teach people what's important within the organisation, rather than having them sit around twiddling their thumbs in the crew room. So I think then that absent of a coherent and credible identity being shown here at ADFA, that informs the broader expectations of the Air Force. The cadets draw inspiration from other areas, and so therefore are filling up their habitus, their toolbox, with stuff that may or may not align with what we want in the Air Force, and also may not be helpful in allowing them to interact and navigate the social environment. I think that we need to look at this, because if we continue to accept a situation where people are performing identities that aren't congruent with our own Air Force and aligned with other services, which incidentally I'm not trying to bash, but I think it's important that we understand that the Air Force, as Steve talked about before, is a unique operating environment, and a one-size-fits-all approach to identity construction doesn't necessarily develop people who are optimised to operate in the air environment once they graduate. And I think worst case scenario is if we leave a situation where people are learning ideal traits that don't resonate with the organisation that we expect them to go into, it could become problematic if the content of those identities excludes or minimises the value of certain types of personnel once they are out in the real Air Force. And with that, I will end. Thank you very much.